which is an upside, really. I mean, well, being from, I'm from
explore kind of who they're going to be.
has a lot of similarities from that
That's like,
perspective.
okay,
So I think when you get into the central states is when it gets a little bit of a different vibe.
and not with the bunch, not with the whole exactly. If you're gonna have a sleepover.
So how long have you been doing
this? It'll be 9 years this month, in about a week. But I've been doing affordable housing advocacy for almost
Check.
in DC. We got for 15 years.
When you got a big party, you can't control.
I mean, it's
Ask my father about big parties.
necessary thing. So.
Well, you know what's been really the
golf carts
most remarkable
driven into
part
lakes.
to me in the last few years is we've gone from, you know, nobody knew.
It's all good. It's all part. You just worry about them surviving, right?
Economic struggles.
Yes.
But hopefully we will house enough. Our daughter, who's a little bit quiet, she worked hard, played hard for the kid, and so with her, I always was concerned that she just
especially
wouldn't
during
stop.
COVID, I think
Funny when she graduated college,
the way that LA was trending was
just work.
especially downtown.
That is fantastic.
Nose to the grindstone.
Nightlife and
You never know.
a lot of
That's how I like my kids.
development. We had multiple
Experience, experience
projects.
life. I'd actually like her to lighten up a little.
And then,
Enjoy things a little bit more now.
what
Travel.
ultimately kind of happened after.
She's for a restaurant. You ever go to Texas?
Yeah.
Not in a long time.
The company she works for is a regional. It's a large regional.
Matter, and it just
Papa,
became really
Papa
like a complete 180 to where it was
the general manager of one of the.
with the marches, etc. And so
It's
I think it just was very apparent that there was
That's right. Exactly.
management.
We got about a 4-minute warning, guys, just to tell you who's we're at. So we're starting right at 9:30. I'm trying to wrestle some people.
Thanks for joining us today.
We're just missing one more. Marquise? Yes. Oh, sorry. Nice meeting you. Just looking for you. But yeah, we're going to start in about 4 minutes. Okay, great. You're all set? Okay.
Marquise, Jim Stanley.
If you need water, there is water up front.
Good. Nice long drive this morning.
Where'd you come in from?
I'm turning from South Carolina.
Okay.
I live, I can see the SoFi Stadium from my backyard. Really? Yeah.
How are you? Rolling Stones. So excited.
Can you hear it? Can you hear it? taping this, so make sure you talk into the microphone.
Okay.
Great. Mask on or mask off?
When you're talking, masks off.
Mask off. Okay.
I'm going off. Oh, that's a good idea. You guys busy?
Oh my gosh.
Y'all are doing these two big monster things I drove by on the way in at Universal?
No. We got a big project out here in North Hollywood though, but we haven't started construction.
Is it residential?
It's everything. So it's the big metro.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody.
They're gonna relocate.
Welcome to VICA's 33rd Annual Business Forecast Conference and to the housing panel titled, Is Every House a Gatsby House? I know mine isn't. My name's Brad Rosenheim. I am the proud sponsor of today's Track 1. I'm also the chair of VICA. And before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Suffolk and the Southern Regional Association of Realtors. I don't know why that's hard for me to say. Now, at your seat, there's an exit survey for this panel. I'd like to encourage everybody to fill that out at the end of the panel. And then there will be a VICA staff member or ambassador at the back of the room where you can turn that in. So very much appreciate your participation in that. We need your feedback back in order to prepare for next year, and only take a minute or two. The biographies of the panelists are already in the journal, so I'm going to make a very brief introduction, and that way we'll have more time for questions at the end. Our panelists today are Alan Greenlee, and Alan is the Executive Director of the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing. Thanks for being with us, Alan. We're privileged to have Los Angeles Council Member Marquise Harris Dawson, who is the Chair of the Planning and Land Use Management Committee of the Los Angeles City Council. Thank you for being here. Jim Stanley, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Los Angeles Suffolk. I don't know why I have trouble saying that word. Suffolk, much easier. And Alex Valente, who's the Senior Vice President of Trammell Crow Company. Thank you all for being here with us. Now, as I say the next sentence, keep in mind of what the theme is today for the business forecast, because I don't normally talk like this. Even not so swanky housing costs some dough. So California, as we all know, has a hot housing market. There are bureaucratic hurdles. There are raw material shortages that leave home ownership and home rental unattainable for millions of people. We must put our heads together to get housing built despite steadfast opposition, because clearly this is one of, if not the most pressing issues facing our region and the entire state. Let's keep in mind this is a forecast, so let's discuss how we can build more housing at all market levels. Where can we build it, and what kind of housing will actually get built? In short, what's the horizon for housing in California? I'm going to give each of our panelists a couple of minutes to make an opening statement to get things started, and then we're going to ask, or I'll ask some questions of each of the members of the panel, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. And I would encourage you to argue with one another, agree with one another as you feel fit. Alan, we'll get started with you for a couple minutes introduction.
Terrific. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Alan Greenlee. I'm the Executive Director of the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing. Thanks, Brad, for not only sponsoring the event, but for moderating our discussion today. Thank you to VICA for hosting this event, which is like 3 miles from my house, so that was nice. And thanks to Stuart for cramming me into a suit for the first time in the last 18 months. So SCANF is a membership organization, for lack of a better term, a trade association that represents nonprofits that are in the business of building and operating housing for low-income people. We have about 250 members. We represent the 5 Southern California counties of Ventura, LA, Riverside, San Bernardino, and Orange, and Los Angeles, which actually is about 19 million people, about half the state. And my thought has always been, if we could get the affordable housing kittens in this region into a box, we could really wag the tail of the dog, to mix metaphors, in Sacramento about what happens on housing policy. But that is a continuing effort. I think the last thing is just like VICA, we do work that is kind of member focused on capacity building and training. We work with local governments to create ecosystems where housing can be built and operated effectively, and we do public policy interventions at the local, state, and federal levels. I look forward to the conversation today. Thanks very much, Alan. I was just wondering, does anybody else find that their suits shrunk over the last 2 years? Because it was shocking when I tried on my suit today. Council member, some introductory remarks.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for having us, and I want to thank VICA for the 90-minute drive from South Los Angeles. We got to see a lot of the city and a lot of the region this morning, and so we're very appreciative of that. And it's good to be here and good to engage in this discussion with folks who are on the side of the equation that provides housing. As the chairperson of the PLUM Committee, the Planning and Land Use Committee in the Los Angeles City Council, we get to see both sides of it. We get to see the people trying to produce housing, and then we get to see almost every single person who's trying to stop housing. And we have to manage the process because we live in a democracy, but we're at a stage now where our city is literally in a crisis. We cannot house, we don't have the ability to house our people, which is one of the most basic ways in which you evaluate the quality of a society. We have a cacophony of laws and policies that never contemplated the notion that we wouldn't have enough space to provide housing. And so all of those laws are still on the books and all those policies are still on the books. And the forces that want to stop housing are really good at exploiting those policies. And so I think what all of us have to do is imagine a new future and then sort of not be afraid to go in and break some china in order to create the landscape that allows us to create a new reality.
Thanks very much, Council Member. Jim? Doesn't seem to be working.
Should I wipe this off? First of all, go Dodgers. All right. It's the best way to start. I felt it's a good icebreaker. So Jim Stanley, Chief Operating Officer for Suffolk Construction here in the LA region. So a little bit about Suffolk. Well, before that, thank you to VICA in this opportunity to speak. We are a general contractor nationwide that was founded in 1982. We have a single shareholder, and we have offices throughout the U.S. I think what's really pertinent for this panel is our experience in the affordable sector. We have a little over 1 billion of completed housing, and that translates to about 11,000 nationally of affordable units, which we think is really an important part of our business model. Me personally, I live right down the street in Burbank, so I don't have to complain about the 90-minute drive from the south of downtown, but I really appreciate this opportunity and look forward to the really intelligent conversation. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jim. And Alex.
Thank you. Good morning. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you to VICA. And great to be up here with these guys up here on the panel. Alex Valente, I'm with the Trammell Crow Company. I'm actually here with my colleagues Andrew Parker and James Holt over there. We kind of make up the multifamily team for the Trammell Crow Company here in Los Angeles. For those who don't know about Trammell Crow, we are the nation's largest developer right now. We've got about $20 billion in process and in pipeline across 18 offices here in the U.S., and we recently expanded into London a couple of years ago with the acquisition of Telford Homes, another home builder out in England, and we are an independently operated subsidiary of CBRE, which is the world's largest real estate services company. It's about a Fortune 125 company right now. Today's topic is housing. Andrew, James, and myself, we lead our housing team here in LA, and we do that under the brand name, a lot of brand names, but High Street Residential, which is kind of a long story, but we do all of our multifamily housing under High Street. We've got about, just in LA County right now, about 700 units kind of in production right now, and about another 2,500 units behind that here in LA County. And probably the most notable one, especially maybe in these circles, is our District NoHo project, which was the big Metro RFP, where the red line and the orange line intersect over there on Chandler and Lancashire. Honored to be here and excited to jump into a fun conversation.
Thanks very much, Alex, and thank you all. So, Councilmember Harris-Dawson, we'll get started with you.
Yeah.
Your role as chair of the City Council Planning and Land Use Management Committee gives you a unique view into the city's affordable housing efforts. Tell us a little bit about what the city is doing, what you're doing to streamline affordable housing projects, and what should be done to address council districts that fail to build affordable housing and permanent supportive housing in their districts.
Well, thank you for the question. You know, part of the misnomer, or something that I've certainly come to learn, is that the Plum Committee is much more management than it is planning. So the planning and land use part get much less bandwidth than the management part. Essentially, what we do is we manage processes. The folks mostly in the private sector come and want to build affordable housing or market rate housing, and it's the job of the council and the city to manage that process against competing forces. And so there's a few things that the city can do. One of them is coming up very, very soon, and that's really looking at the housing element for the city of Los Angeles. That allows us to take some aggressive steps to create incentives for creating affordable housing near job centers. I mean, not only do we have a lack of affordable housing production in Los Angeles and Southern California, but of the housing production we have, 85% of it is away from the places where jobs are. And so we create problems for the environment and traffic and mobility and all the rest. So the housing element really allows us to create incentives for the parts of our city, and frankly, we need the help. There's no way we do this without the help of the state. To create incentives to build housing in the places that are job centers and high opportunity housing, as well as to reward the places in the city in substantial and material ways that have taken the step to build housing, like my district produces a disproportionate share of the affordable housing, but my district doesn't see any benefit as a result of doing that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting comment, because communities that are willing to accept whether housing of any sort, affordable housing, or even business opportunities, don't get rewarded for that, and that's something that really would seem to be an opportunity for the city to capitalize on. Maybe encourage communities that they're going to get something back in exchange for accepting that growth.
Right, and I would go further to say it not only is there not an incentive, it's almost a punishment. So if my neighboring cities to the west, Culver City and Inglewood, they can create a bunch of low-wage jobs, but not create any places for those people to live. Well, guess whose district has to house those people?
Right.
And guess whose district has to provide policing and transportation and, by the way, school? All of things that, again, cost the residents resources. And meanwhile, across the way, that municipality is enjoying all of the tax benefits of having those businesses there and none of the responsibility.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Looks like we're having some technical issues.
I might have knocked your mic off with my gift bag.
Is yours working, Alex?
Is mine working? Mine works, yes.
Okay. All right. So, Alan.
Yes.
What residential real estate development innovations are on the horizon that can dramatically increase production of housing in a more efficient, time-sensitive manner?
Hopefully a lot. I think a way to respond to that question is, I think it's kind of two buckets of opportunity, two buckets of innovation. One was sort of pointed out by Councilmember Harris Dawson around this idea of public policy making. You know, the state in the last 5 years or so has taken kind of an unprecedented position on imposing its state-mandated will on local jurisdictions and local communities. And, you know, land use policy has always been the parlance of local areas, and as a result, we have a city that looks like the way the city looks. And I think that the state's willingness to kind of supersede local control in some cases provides the opportunity to build in a different way in a place like the city of Los Angeles. And I'm not here to sort of decide which is right and which is wrong, but I do think that what's interesting about the state's role in the last few years is that it brings a detachment from the local sort of passions and creates the opportunity to look from a longer term perspective about what's in the best interest from a housing perspective for our communities. And so I think that debate, you know, I think local communities have started to recognize that that's an issue, have organized themselves and are weighing in on state policy, particularly in housing and land use in a new way. And I think that that froth will be interesting for the next few years. The other thing I would just say is that, you know, regions now are starting to think in terms of regional perspectives to create long time horizons and kind of broad public policy benefits on residential real estate development. So for example, in San Francisco, they created the Bay Area, I forget what it's called now, it's like BAFA or something, but it's a regional housing agency that looks at land use and planning. And similarly, down here in Southern California, United Way and a coalition of folks called Our Future LA, Senator Kamlager introduced SB 679, which was intended to create LA County Regional Housing Authority, the Los Angeles County Affordable Housing Solutions Agency, or La CASA. And the concept there was we were going to create an agency that had some capacities to make land use, funding, and public policy decisions on a regional basis. And I think there's some real merit there. The other, and I can talk about public policy forever, but I'm going to stop in an effort to try to be slightly brief. But the other area is building technology. Essentially, you know, I think as Jim would say, maybe he wouldn't, you know, we've been building stuff kind of the same way for 100 years. And there's been very few major innovations in the way stuff gets built. And I think that there's some real opportunity there associated with things like modular prefabricated components for buildings. But there's a whole ton of economic issues associated with realizing the efficiency and the capacity of those technologies. And so, again, I think that's going to take a little bit of work.
Thanks very much, Alan. Jim, are you online now? Yes. There we go. All right. So how have commodities and supply chain logistics hindered construction, and what's the outlook for the construction employment figures? And I'm just curious, are you finding it challenging or hearing it industry-wide that there's a challenge finding people to actually work in the industry?
So to answer that, I mean, a few different things. So on the commodities front, I think we all know that there's been just a universal uptick in the cost of building materials, and that's just carte blanche, and obviously COVID was a big contributing factor. What we are seeing right now is just as the restrictions on COVID have lowered, it's given some opportunity for those commodities to be manufactured, but they're not all necessarily getting to market where the design or the desire for those commodities is increased now that construction's starting to ramp back up. They're just not able to feed the necessities of the market. And then just on the supply chain front, I think we all know when we've tried to order something on Amazon, it's just taking forever on things that are coming from overseas. I think the Port of Long Beach is one of the biggest or hardest hit from that perspective. And luckily, you know, there was something from the president just this past Wednesday where they're kind of working around too, you know, we're building a project in downtown, and we're, you know, feeding the curtain wall system from the South America, and we started shipping to Long Beach, moved to Texas, and have subsequently had to move all the way to Florida in order to get the materials trucked across the country just to get it to our project in order to meet schedule. So I think the supply chain has a ways to go, but I do think that the lightning and the additional resources working in Long Beach should, you know, see dividends in the next 2 to 3 months, we're hoping. And then on the, you know, workforce, I think the skilled labor, I mean, the unemployment rates for skilled labor was, you know, nearing 10% in, I think, February of this year, whereas now we're somewhere around below 5%, which is really positive. I think it's really market driven too. So like if you would think in California and Hawaii, for instance, I mean, the unemployment rate's really low, while in like Nevada, for instance, in Las Vegas, it's still pretty high from that, you know, really driven by the construction market specifically. I think the unskilled labor is the real challenge, is, you know, drawing in new interest into this market and, you know, training those individuals. I think that's the concern that we really have as a market as a whole, is how are we going to be able to bring in that talent or the future talent and, you know, build out teams that can actually execute upon the work. So there's a positive outlook, and, you know, we're optimistic.
Great, thank you very much. Alex, is your mic working now? There we go.
Still working.
It's no surprise to most of us in the room that it's hard to build in LA, especially as developers are constantly challenged by local communities who don't necessarily want that new development. What have you seen resonating with community groups when it comes to building housing?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. Outreach. And it's got to be early, and it's got to be consistent, and it's got to be direct. So, you know, we put a really big priority on ourselves getting out there in the community. I mean, housing is such an emotional thing for people where they live. So kind of getting out there into the community, building trust and doing it yourself, there's really no substitute for it. So I think, in my mind, that's kind of where it starts and ends. And sure, you've got to have the economics on a project and all that, but at the end of the day, if you don't kind of build trust with the community, with the local councilman, with the neighbors, you're kind of never going to get off on the right foot. And I think most you know, call it the bigger developers across the country, I think everyone kind of gets that. But just because you understand it doesn't change the fact that you still have to get out there and do it and knock on doors. And we take a lot of pride in how we do that. For example, you know, we have our district NoHo project, which we've been in. We don't even have true control of it yet. We don't even have a JDA yet, but, you know, we've been involved for 4 years now. I think we've had something like almost 90 stakeholder meetings to date, and we don't even have a deal yet. And I think, you know, that's just the expectation. Metro's set that expectation from the beginning, and hopefully it's part of the reason why they chose us. But I think if you're going to develop in these communities, again, it's so emotional. You have to get out there early and connect with folks. And you're never going to make everyone happy, but generally we found that just listening early, you know, you end up getting a better project. So it usually becomes a win-win thing, which we love.
I think that my experience in that has been you can get some really good input that does make a project better. Council member, you hear a lot of this in council and at the committee. Can you share some of the primary concerns that communities are raising about whether it's affordable housing or market rate housing or mixed housing?
Well, the community's main concern is that their neighborhood is going to be altered, and their way of life is going to be altered, and they're going to be left holding the bag. So whether it's increased traffic in one part of town, or it's noise in another part of town, or, you know, for instance, in my district, residents will legitimately say, there's already no parking at the local grocery store, and you want to add 300 units? where are people going to eat? How are people going to eat? And so, and they understand very clearly that once that thing is built, no one's going to be there to help them. And so I think to the extent that I think outreach is extremely important, and I think relationships are important. And I think they're important on both sides. And I'll just put this out because I know I'm in a room full of people who are more on the development side. What I find is the developers that do their due diligence in terms of outreach end up learning things about the neighborhood and how life is there that they wouldn't have known otherwise, that make them change their projects and make them say, oh, I can help provide this solution to that problem as a part of my project. Something that, may be benign, may actually help their project. But they would have had no way of knowing that unless and until they spent time in the neighborhood with people getting information, and vice versa.
Could I speak to that? First of all, both of you, I think, are saying the truth, which is, you got to talk to your neighbors to see how they think about what their neighborhood should look like, which I think is really terrific. We have a few members who are really good at that work, because if you go to a neighborhood and you say, you know what, we're going to put a building in your neighborhood, we're going to put a bunch of homeless people there who are chronically homeless, and they're drug addicted, and they've got, they've got emotional issues. The neighborhood, rightly so, has concerns. One of the things we've found is that if you take people to a place where a building like that currently exists, it defangs the opposition in a serious way. First of all, 7 times out of 10, they don't even know that that's an affordable housing apartment building. It blends into the neighborhood in ways that make sense just from a visual perspective. And then the second part is this interaction that the council member mentions. This idea is that developers have to go in and realize that they're going into a neighborhood, going in to be part of a community that already exists. And they want to make sure that those developments are as sensitive and contributing to that community as possible. So I think that's an important point that can't be overstated.
Thanks very much. Jim?
Just wanted to add one more thing. I mean, obviously, my perspective is on the construction side, but it certainly doesn't end at just getting a permit, right? I mean, we have to continue that on through the construction phase and try to lighten that burden. And it is burdensome. I mean, let's be honest, with the trucking, materials, noise, we try to engage with the community throughout the process, keeping them advised of kind of what's happening while it's happening, so that people aren't confused or asking questions. We've done quite a bit of outreach throughout most of our construction projects, where it's just trying to provide visibility. So I completely agree with everybody on the panel.
Jim, is that usually dictated by your client, or is that something you do as a company?
So the client wants you to be proactive, certainly, but it's also just kind of the way that we do business as an organization. I mean, transparency is the foundation of anybody's success as far as we're concerned. So, and again, people that live not just close, but within a certain radius, we either do pamphlets or mass emails. We create like a QR code on our fence showing what the development will be, so you can kind of have clarity, because not everybody knows or is really that involved in the political aspect, through entitlements. And so, it's really filling in the blanks for those that are.
Yeah, no, that's very important. A lot of people see something happening, they don't know what it is, and either they get very upset by not knowing what's happening, and having that opportunity to inform them is really important. So cities are a creature of the state, if I'm not mistaken. In other words, the state or cities' charters and so on are a result of state law. And so they, what I've heard a lot of railing by cities, not necessarily Los Angeles, but some of the smaller cities in the area, about the housing elements and the requirements that are being foisted upon cities to actually meet the housing needs. It's really interesting. It's fascinating how upset they are, and the concept of the state of California telling them what they have to do, what they have to achieve, even though they are a creation of that state. It's that tension between independence, and I know we have a former council member here, sitting in the audience who may have something to say about this, but I find it fascinating to listen to that conversation. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. As was said earlier, the state is coming down with a lot of mandates on local governments. And I'd like to get your thoughts, just generally speaking, about what is the role of the state relative to cities accommodating that housing. And Councilman, we'll start with you.
Well, you know, I think it's a complicated question, and I understand and appreciate the state's interest in weighing in on what's an obvious problem and trying to provide solutions to it. The main problem I see with what they're doing is they try to do a one-size-fits-all for the entire state. It would be very different to me if states empowered counties to gave counties a list of policy options to address these issues. You know, the idea that you would impose the same requirement on Los Angeles as you do on Glendale is ludicrous. Los Angeles produces far more affordable housing than Glendale, so why should we be under the same edict as Glendale, who almost has reverse affordable housing production? And so I think it's extremely problematic. I mean, you think it makes council members upset. You should talk to residents who don't understand why somebody in Sacramento wants to come bother what's happening on their nice, quiet block in whatever part of the city it's happening. Especially when, again, it would be a different thing if the state said, meet your requirement or else. These hammers will drop, right? There are cities, LA is one of them, where there's pretty much a consensus that we do significant density on transportation corridors. Our neighboring cities don't have that. They have the opposite notion, actually. And so I think the state putting cities and counties in position to carry out their vision is a better pathway than opposing a one-size-fits-all.
Alan, did you want to say something?
Well, yes. First of all, appreciate the council members' comments, and they're right. I mean, I think one thing I definitely want to say is that this same concept, which is distinguishing good actors from bad actors. And anybody here from Manhattan Beach? Manhattan Beach doesn't want housing built in their community, and they definitely don't want any poor people there. And they are actively
unless they're going to work.
What's that?
Unless they're going to work there.
Exactly. Unless they're coming in to go to work, right? They want them to come in to go to work. They don't want them to actually be there, and they want them to not create traffic, and they want them to have a place to park. But sorry, that was completely editorial. That was inappropriate.
Editorial's fine.
But the point is that there are communities. There are 80 of the 88 cities in the county of LA. Let's just talk about that are actively trying to keep stuff from getting built. And you could argue that with Measure U, the city has the same posture. But you're right, the city of LA has done a ton to make sure that housing is getting built generally, and that affordable housing for low-income people is getting built in particular. The other thing that's happened that didn't get mentioned, and I assume that you guys know this, but at the risk of sort of mansplaining from here, it's not only the requirement to build housing. This regional housing needs assessment has been around for a while. You know, the city has been under obligation to build the cities have been under obligation to build a certain amount of housing for a while. But what has happened is they changed the way they calculate what the need is. So this year the numbers are astronomical. This new cycle, 9-year cycle, is astronomical. And the other thing that happened is that they've created punitive measures if you're not meeting the goals. So it used to be there was a goal, there was an annual report card that came out and said you're either making it or you're not, but nothing really happened. Now all of a sudden the state is going to impose land use rules on you. Now all of a sudden the communities, the housing departments of the cities are not eligible if they're not performing in certain ways or certain resources from the state. And there are some and that actually has two implications. In Manhattan Beach, they don't care if they don't get the state money. But in Montebello, maybe they do care if they don't get the state money. But they're so under capacity on the housing planning staff side that they don't have the capacity to encourage development to help be able to meet the goals that are imposed. And so I think we need to do a better job of making sure that we are punishing bad actors who are doing it deliberately and making sure that resources are available to housing-friendly communities, but just have low capacity.
Alex, any thoughts on this as a housing producer? If you don't want to make a comment, you don't have to.
No, I'm happy to, and it's obviously a complicated, somewhat controversial topic. I think Marquise hit the nail on the head when he said a lot of cities aren't producing the housing that we need, and there's a whole spectrum of what cities are doing what, but it's just not getting done. I think the recent RENA estimate for the next 9 years of housing need was about 100,000 units a year, and I think LA County's been producing about 10 to 12,000 a year, so clearly not meeting the housing needs of its citizens. So I do think there is a role here for the state, and I think it's much like a CEO would have in a large business, which would be to set the vision and set the strategy, and then defer to the counties and the cities on kind of how to implement it. But I think there has to be somebody pushing to produce housing, and I think it has to come from the state level because it's not happening at the city level. And I think the way that you do that is threefold. I think Marquise hit the nail on the head again too. It comes with incentives. I mean, you've got to incentivize people and align people to produce housing. But it also comes with accountability, and I think that's where it gets a little bit more sensitive. But I think there has to be a stick, otherwise folks won't comply. And I think when I think about a free market and I think about housing, I love the idea of incentives, and I think the other side of that is you've just got to be really careful with interference. I don't know where everyone in this room stands. I think it's probably more of a pro-business, pro-development crowd here, but I think interference always can have the opposite impact of what you hope. Yeah. It's like the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But if you are a proponent of rent control, your heart's in the right place. But I think if you look across the country where you see rent control, you see much, much older housing product, and you don't see enough mobility, you don't see enough production built. So I think, again, great, what's the word I'm looking for? Great intention, but it doesn't have the impact that you're hoping for. I guess that's a long way of saying that I do think the state needs to be involved, but I think it needs to set the strategy, set the vision, and then make sure that there's accountability on the local level. Otherwise, I think we're just going to kind of keep going down this road that we're going down. You've got SB9, SB10. That's kind of a much more smaller single-family, smaller multifamily kind of bundle of the housing. We focus more on commercial stuff. I do think it will possibly stir some housing production, splitting up these single-family lots. I like the idea of it, but I think for the most part, if you're going to improve your housing production, it needs to be along the lines of what the city of LA is trying to do, which is along transit and along job centers. And I think that's where you should focus the housing. And I don't personally find anything wrong with single-family neighborhoods. I mean, I kind of like them. I've got a little bit older. I just recently bought a house. I'm probably case in point. I never thought I would own a house. I'm from Manhattan. Not Manhattan Beach, by the way. It's New York City. But I think that it's nice to have a home, especially as you have a family. I think that idea is a great thing. It's like the American dream. And there's no reason you can't have both. You need to go into, like in Minnesota and go and kind of try to blow up the single-family neighborhood. And there's all sorts of reasons that go back, generations on why these neighborhoods have developed the way they have. My personal opinion, I suppose, is focusing it along transit and jobs makes all the sense in the world, and why not try to have both? It's one of the nice things about living in LA is that you can live in a house in a city center. I mean, again, from New York City, you can't find that in Manhattan. I think it's one of the really nice things about being in LA.
Thanks very much, Alex. So you mentioned SB9 and SB10, And I'd love to hear your just broad thoughts. Do you think this is going to have much of an impact in the Los Angeles city, for instance, and the local region? I'm fascinated by the concept. You know, SB10 is a little bit more broad, right? It gives the city the right to change the zoning around transit without having to deal with CEQA, although my understanding is the projects themselves will still have to deal with CEQA. But SB9 is fascinating to me, and I'm curious your thoughts about how you think it's really going to change, if it will change the nature of the single-family neighborhood in a meaningful way. And meaningful, I mean substantial way. Go ahead, council member. We'll let you go get started.
You know, it's hard to predict what people will do. I think a lot of it depends on the economy. But, you know, my fear is it's just going to make single-family homes that much more expensive. And I think it's going to drive the price up. But I don't think you're going to see people splitting their lots if they live there. I think you'll see corporations. I mean, that's already happening in my district, where corporations are about 8 out of 10 single-family homes that go on the market are being bought by some corporation who's, you know, splitting them, making 3, 4 units. But even in that situation, it's not substantial enough to dramatically change the landscape. Like, it's not like we have this so much more housing capacity because this is happening, because even people who are relatively low income, you ask them, do you want to split your lot and you'll get, you know, a few $1,000s a month more? Most people say, no, I'm good. I'll keep my lawn and my driveway and my garage. So I mean, I think, you know, this suburban landscape ethic is so strong in Southern California that I think it's very hard. I mean, you know, you talked about being from Manhattan. You know, my family moved from the South specifically because when you talk, you know, my great-grandparents were alive and grandparents were alive, they specifically came here because you could buy a house with a lawn and a sidewalk in front of it, which if you were black in the South, you couldn't buy a house anywhere where there was any development. So, you know, the idea that you're going to go split one of those houses and make it a duplex, it's like declaring war on people. So I think it'll be very tough.
Yeah, that's kind of been my impression, too.
Yeah.
Alan?
Well, just slightly. So the short answer is I don't know, but I do think one thing that's kind of interesting is as the sort of the baby boomer bubble moves, and we've got people like me, for example, who are complicit in the yard and the family. You know, I'm going to retire at some point, and you know, I believe that SB9 made my property more valuable, and I'm going to cash out, and then I'm going to sell my house to whoever's willing to give me the most money. They will, and because I'm going to take that cash, I'm going to move to Tennessee or somewhere. You know what I mean? I'm going to move someplace where I can afford to live as an older person. And I think so figuring out what SB9 means in that context is really important. I don't know the answer to it, but I think it's...
I just thought it was a good way to screw my neighbors.
Right.
I'm sorry. I love my neighbors. Any other comments on that? Jim?
I think, I mean, similar to what Alex said, I mean, we're a commercial builder, so it doesn't necessarily impact our kind of construction market model, but I think, you know, from a personal perspective, I mean, I live in Burbank. I have you know, my house was built in 1918, so similar to, you know, what everybody was talking about. I think, you know, it's the outlook of, you know, who's moving in and the density increase. I do appreciate what everybody's been saying just about development kind of, you know, on the transit opportunities where you can move people, and looking for those kind of opportunities is really, you know, important to our business model, certainly. But kind of slightly shifting gears on just like what, you know, we as general contractors, we just have to think differently, right? We have to make the opportunities, you know, to make these affordable opportunities actually happen. And that's, you know, when we were talking earlier about, Alan and I, just about modular construction, is, you know, why is that happening out of state, right? You know, because of the increased cost of labor relative to, you know, what you can achieve here locally. And so, you know, we're just trying to figure out ways to, you know, stir things up and make things more affordable so that more construction can happen.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to open it up to questions So does anybody have a question? Don't all jump up at once. I see Fred. Fred Gaines? Was there a question there, Fred?
Yeah. Could I answer that? I have a couple of thoughts that I could end with a question mark if you want. So first of all, I agree with you. Yeah, the State of the State was all about housing, but a preponderance of that was about homelessness. And then COVID hit, and we all went and sequestered for a while, and then we started moving around a little bit, and it was like, holy mackerel, it got worse. And so I believe, my personal opinion is, once the governor got past the recall thing and we sort of tried to emerge a little bit from COVID, there would be a renewed vigor and interest on that very topic. And so still continue to be hopeful that that's coming. And certainly welcome the Valley Economic Development Group focusing on housing. I think one thing I definitely want to make sure we talk about, or that I mentioned, is, you know, there's people are understanding that there's a problem, and organizations like the one you mentioned are starting to organize and start to talk about, hey, we need to figure out a way to turn this, to not make this a binary conversation about development or not development. We need to figure out what the answer is. I think another interesting element to think of is half of the voters in the city of Los Angeles are renters. And so as soon as those guys get organized, you know, all right, then policy will change, I can guarantee you. The other thing that really is frustrating to me is in the context of homelessness in particular, and I don't know if you were explicitly talking about Measure HHH, you were talking about ADUs, but Measure Triple H was a bond initiative, $1.2 billion to build 10,000 permanent supportive housing units in the city. There's not, support housing that has services in it for chronically homeless people is the best way to deal with homelessness. The best way. Problem is, it's expensive and it takes a long time to build. And I'm not here to change your minds on this because I think the Court of Public Opinion has already decided that Triple H was a failure, but I'm here to tell you that those units are getting built at cheaper than they thought they were going to get built, and we will surpass the number in less time than we said we would. So you can decide whether you think it's a failure or not, but the program is working the way the program is supposed to do. I think what happened in the mind of the voter was, had an opportunity to vote on a bond initiative, and in their mind they said, I want to get rid of that homeless guy in the corner. And today that homeless guy is not only not gone, but there's another person there with him. And so my point is that it takes resources to get people off the street. It takes long-time concerted resources to get people off the street. And this environment where we get into kind of a resource limitation conversation between emergency interventions to shelter people versus long-term, what we know are proven successes, is a false argument. There's plenty of resources to figure out a way to address homelessness here, and we need to do both.
Any other thoughts on that? All right. Any other questions? Yes. Thanks very much. It's a big question. I think one of the challenges with RENA, if I'm not mistaken, is that the state requirement requires the city to demonstrate that there's a strong likelihood that that property that's identified can actually become multiple residential or additional housing. I think that's one of the challenges with relative to RENA and single-family neighborhoods is it's very difficult for the city to demonstrate that there's a likelihood, and that's where SB9 kind of comes in because it does provide that opportunity without having to rezone the property. But panelists, council member.
Well, I think that's a lot. I think one of the challenges is, and Alan got my back up a little bit talking about HHH and how it's been declared a failure. Well, but here's the thing: HHH is a failure compared to what? So, as an example, many of the transit corridors, just to do a little footnote there, many of the transit corridors that May talks about, they've already been upzoned. And guess what? The private sector is taking just as long to build there, in fact, longer to build as the city's taking to build with HHH, right? And you can say they're cheaper, but saying something in the private sector is cheaper only means that you're providing more profit to the investor. It doesn't actually mean that the body politic benefits in a more significant way. I have a unit on Crenshaw that cost the city $500,000 to do. Next door to it, I have a unit that the private sector did for $200,000. Guess what? To the people who live in the community, those units are the same. Doesn't matter that they cost it that much. And so, I appreciate you raising the point about there being some reasonable expectation that the rezoning will actually result in the production of land, because I think, one of the things we're reluctant to do in this society is take a hard look at the private sector and whether or not, in fact, they're delivering on what the promise is. And rezoning as a strategy in general assumes that the private sector is going to perform. And I think the results of that don't get examined often enough, and I'll leave it at that.
Could I
Alan?
just want to make sure we're on the same side on Triple H,
totally.
by the way. I want to be on the same side as you as often as possible. Private sector opportunity. In 2016, Measure Triple J passed and included a component in it that said that if a developer voluntarily within a certain distance from transit decided to use extra density, they could. They just had to make sure they included affordable units in it. And over the time that program has been instituted, the private sector, without using $1 of public subsidy funds, has built about the same amount of units of housing as my members have built for low-income people, for extremely low-income people. And when we were working on Triple H, there was a bunch of people who were not happy with the idea that it was happening, saying it was going to increase development costs. And I'll just say, with due respect to the people who were saying that, are the ones that are building those extremely low-income units today. And so the bottom line is that public policy can affect behavior. It can affect behavior in a way that is efficient and streamlined. I don't actually know what to do with your question. There's so much going on there. The one thing I'll just add to the question is, I think in terms of community residents, in two ways, the community residents that you alluded to. One is sort of traditionally black neighborhoods where homeownership has happened over the course of a generation. Those families are realizing the benefits of the system, right? And that's a good thing. It's family wealth, institutional wealth that creates longevity and has all sorts of great outcomes, and I don't want to damage that for sure. But there are communities who have been locked out of that opportunity, and there are ways to create additional community benefits if we build the programs the right way. So there's this concept happening around this idea of creating community ownership opportunity for people who otherwise can't really buy a house. So for example, could you allow for a community land trust to accept a parcel of land hold it in the public trust and allow the people that move into that building to have some benefit of the appreciation of that property over time. And I just think that, like, I don't know the answer to that. That's like really a hard thing to unknot, but I think that it's an obligation to us to be able to try to figure out how to do all of those things all at one time. And I think it was one of the Kennedys said one of the Kennedys that said something like, we don't do these things, we do these things because they're hard or something like that. Like we owe it to ourselves to really think in broad terms about what it takes to both build and make sure that the benefits of that building and the benefits of our systems are as equitably discharged as possible.
Yeah, and I don't want to skip over, May, that you raised the issue of race in general, but with black people specifically. And I'll just say this about that. I think there's not a category of life in this country where black folks don't end up on the short end of the stick. And that started from that's in the DNA of this question. And so I think until we get as a society to the place where we say, we're gonna deal with that specifically, it's gonna show up in every area of life. So if you leave this panel and go to another panel that's about another topic, you're gonna find that black people are at the short end of that stick too. And so I think that has to be dealt with once and for all, or else it's going to continue to resurface in everywhere we've gone. And I don't say that as a way to make excuses about anything being done or not done. I just say it's, when it comes to race, there are lots of particularities in history that come with that are hard to unpack in isolation. Like you can't just deal with it in healthcare or deal with it in education or deal with it in public safety. You've got to deal with it across the board.
And that's a big issue.
Yes.
Any other comments on May's question?
The only thing I'll say, and maybe I'll just kind of piggyback.
Alex, can you?
The only thing I'll add, I'll just piggyback on Alan's point, but you know, the bottom line is none of us really know what to do here. We're all trying to figure it out.
Yeah, there you go.
and you know, we try different things, and if it doesn't work, we try something else. I do think JJJ, which is 5 years new, has actually been really poignant in the fact of how much housing production has happened because of TOC, and has happened because of policy setting incentives. And it's no secret that private sector they're going to pursue the pathway to profitability in whatever sector we're in. We happen to be in housing, and we're stewards of capital for endowments and pensions and folks that and money sources that kind of circle back into the same communities. But we're going to pursue the most straightforward, efficient path, and TOC ended up presenting a pathway that has seemingly worked. So I think the more that we can figure out what's worked elsewhere, and try to recreate it here, and we'll probably fall on our faces, but we'll learn something in the process and then try something new. I mean, we have to keep trying, and I think we just have to keep looking and using pathways that have found success, and then just keep iterating. But there has to be vision, and there has to be urgency, and I think we finally have that here. And I think TOC is just a great way to increase production that will whether it's trickle down, whether it's mixed income, which I actually happen to believe in. I think a lot of people here do. I think that works, and I mean, LA is such a diverse, amazing place, but keeping people together with transit, with jobs, with their housing close to jobs. Frankly, I think some of the lower income areas. I mean, when we look at producing housing, we're directly looking at incomes, right? Because the cost to build is so great, you have to be able to justify it with rents and folks that can pay those rents. So you're actually really looking at jobs. I mean, you generally just start with jobs first, and then housing will absolutely follow. I'm not sure I answered your question. I appreciate it. I think I know everybody in this room is really trying to figure out how this can work in this kind of crazy ecosystem that's LA and kind of the rest of the country.
That's a great point. You mentioned jobs, and jobs is we're suffering now, right? We're suffering with creating jobs in the state of California because of the cost of housing. As a parent of somebody who went to school out of state and decided to stay out of state because she could get a good job and afford to buy a home at a young age, it's very disheartening. And I think a lot of us face that, and it's sort of something that really has to be dealt with very directly. Sir, you had a question, and we're going to have to, this will be the last question, so.
He works at SCANF now. We just hired him, I think.
No, I agree with you. I mean, so just a quick little story. I know we're at the end of the time. When I came onto the council, I'd worked on almost every social issue except for homelessness and housing. I had zero experience in it. And, I got in, and within months, council president says, hey, by the way, you're going to sponsor this housing bond that we're doing for homelessness. Go out there and get it done. So we did it. And I was kind of happy because I thought, oh, we just raised $1 billion. We're going to get some housing in a year or two. Not even close, like nowhere near close. One of the things I've learned, and you know this much better than me, is the whole process of developing affordable housing in particular is a house of cards. It's, I don't know how many developers I get a call from and they say, well, my such and such form fell through, which means my other thing fell through, which means my other thing fell through, which means you have to wait another 18 months. Yep. And you have these things that are dependent upon each other, and I'm sitting there as a complete novice, low information observer saying, well, all these things are asking for the same information. Why isn't it one application that gets considered at the same time by the state, by the tax credit people, by the city, by the county home, all of it. So I think there's some opportunity there to shrink that process, the financing process, just like I think there's an opportunity to shrink the permitting and entitlement process. Any other final comments?
Get in touch with your federal elected officials and tell them that the housing stuff needs to stay in the infrastructure bill, because that bond cap matter that you raised is on the chopping block, and it could bring hundreds of thousands of units to the state of California.
And I think it's a great idea. Sorry, everybody. Sorry, Vika. I think it's a great idea if we have somebody in city leadership who has federal experience. So I'll just leave it at that.
I don't understand what you mean. Well, you know what's amazing is we've had this conversation about housing and the challenges. Not one mention of CEQA. That'll be next year.
Yeah.
Alan, Alex, Marquise, Jim, thank you very much for being here. Our time is up. I'd like to thank Suffolk and the Southland Regional Association of Realtors for sponsoring us today, and also me for being the track sponsor. And if we could have a round of applause for our panelists. Very much appreciate you taking your time and a long trip to get here and be with us today. Please be sure to fill out your exit survey. The VICA staff will be happy, or volunteers will be happy to pick them up from you. The next panel will begin at 11 a.m. In the meantime, I encourage you to visit the exhibitors and make sure you return your bingo card for prizes, including Southwest Airlines tickets, a signed football by me, and the Rams, and a staycation at the Garland. Thank you all very much. Okay. I did my job.
You had the best time of the day. None of us knows what we're doing.
Oh, hey, how are you? Beautiful as always.
When you guys are, that's part of the innovation program, so that it's a very specific application.
It's true, I'm on the tail.
But if it's sort of testing the question about the molecular technology, I think we've sort of come up with standard ways to do it.
Well, thank you for.
Is this your bag? Don't forget your bag. Thank you.
I will fill this out. Right, that's mine. Do I need to fill this out?
No. Oh, no.
I thought there's something I need to fill out.
City
Oh.
investment was
Okay. Well, there's a lot of notes here. Too much writing. I probably won't fill it out.
starting to take geographic locations back. It's a real mess. But the city, in some ways, Rushmore in particular, on that first set of stuff, where they put in more money, it was pretty smart. Some of that. Not all of it.
I'll take it, because I just was like, wait, what? That's a rule? I thought I was going to say. She's got a lot of moxie, and she's like, you know, she's not looking for another job.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
That's what you want.
Any other time?